They thought it was just another massive grizzly, injured, quiet, oddly still. Nathan and Rebecca Foster froze on the trail, cameras forgotten as the enormous bear staggered toward them. But instead of charging, the beast collapsed at their feet, its dark eyes fixed on them with an unmistakable plea. When Dr. Abigail Whitmore arrived with the rescue team, she expected to find a dying predator. What she discovered beneath her ultrasound wand made her weathered hands tremble. "Dear God," whispered Ranger Scott, coffee thermos clattering to the ground as he stared at the monitor. The younger vet techs backed away, faces pale in the afternoon light. Abigail touched the screen where a tiny heartbeat flickered inside the massive male bear. Impossible. Unprecedented, yet undeniable. "In 42 years of wildlife medicine," she said, her voice barely audible, "I've never seen anything like this." What was this bear protecting? And how far would they go to save them both? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Yellowstone National Park had seen its fair share of wildlife wonders over the years, but nothing quite like this. The Emergency Veterinary Center, a converted ranger station with medical equipment that had seen better days, buzzed with tension as staff prepared for their unusual patient. Dr. Abigail Whitmore hadn't planned on spending her Thursday like this. At 70, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that bore the weathered evidence of 4 decades in wildlife medicine, she had been packing up her office when the call came in. Retirement loomed just 2 weeks away, a prospect that filled her with more dread than relief. "We're ready to transport," called Nathan Foster, the lanky photographer whose afternoon hike with his wife had turned into something extraordinary. His flannel shirt was stained with the bear's blood where he'd helped stabilize the massive animal. Beside him, Rebecca adjusted her camera strap nervously, her usual confidence shaken by what they'd witnessed. "Hold compression on that wound," Abigail instructed, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had defined her career. "This bear should have run or attacked. Seeking human help goes against everything we know about grizzly behavior." The bear, estimated at over 800 pounds with an unusually dark coat, had been sedated for transport. Even unconscious, there was something remarkable about him. Something in the scars that marked his muzzle, and the unusual pattern around his shoulders spoke of a long, hard life in the wild. "We've seen him before," said Ranger Scott Anderson, thumbing through tracking records on his tablet. "The locals call him Shadow. Been monitoring him for years, always solitary, never aggressive toward humans, but never friendly either, until today." Abigail studied the preliminary vitals. "Severely dehydrated, multiple lacerations, signs of blunt trauma to the skull." She paused, touching a curious circular wound on the bear's shoulder. "And this isn't from nature." As the team transferred Shadow onto the reinforced medical table, Abigail felt a strange connection to this creature. Perhaps it was something in those intelligent eyes before the sedation took hold, a depth of awareness that had startled her. "Who did this to you?" she whispered. The ultrasound had confirmed something medical textbooks would declare impossible. A living bear cub somehow protected inside a makeshift pouch-like structure within the male bear's digestive tract, not being digested, being sheltered. "The director's asking if we should euthanize," Scott said quietly, looking at his phone. "Says it's the humane option." Abigail straightened, feeling every one of her 70 years, and yet suddenly more alive than she had felt in decades. "You tell the director that in 42 years I've put down animals when there was no other choice," she said, pulling on fresh gloves. "But there's still hope here, and I won't retire before I understand what this bear is trying to tell us." The Yellowstone Wildlife Medical Center transformed into a hive of focused energy as Abigail directed her team with the precision that had earned her respect across the conservation community. Shadow lay on the reinforced examination table, his massive chest rising and falling with labored breaths, while monitoring equipment beeped steadily in the background. "Temperatures stabilizing but still too low," reported Emily Wilson, the young veterinary surgeon who had been mentored by Abigail for the past 5 years. Her capable hands moved across the bear's thick fur, assessing wounds with gentle efficiency. Multiple lacerations along the flank, significant blood loss, and look at these paw injuries. He's been traveling hard for days. Abigail nodded, her attention focused on positioning the ultrasound wand. "Let's get a better look at our unexpected passenger." The screen flickered to life, revealing the shadowy image that had stunned them all less than an hour ago. The tiny form was more visible now, a bear cub, no more than a few weeks old, somehow held within a portion of Shadow's digestive tract that appeared to have formed a protective pocket. "I don't understand," Emily whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "Male bears kill cubs. They don't protect them. This goes against everything we know about grizzly behavior." Ranger Scott Anderson stood at the edge of the room, arms crossed over his uniform. "Should we alert the park director about this development?" His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man caught between protocol and the extraordinary. "Not yet," Abigail replied without looking up. "I want to be certain before we turn this into a circus." The double doors swung open as Nathan and Rebecca Foster entered, having changed from their hiking clothes into clean attire provided by the center. Rebecca's camera hung around her neck, a professional habit she couldn't shed even in crisis. "How is he?" Nathan asked, his voice hushed as though they were in a hospital room. Abigail gestured them closer. "Stable for now, but we're dealing with something unprecedented." She pointed to the ultrasound screen. "That cub is alive, and somehow this male grizzly has been protecting it." Rebecca's hand went to her mouth. "Is that even possible?" "Scientifically speaking, no," Abigail admitted, "which means we're witnessing something science hasn't documented yet." The center's phone rang and Scott stepped away to answer it. When he returned, his expression had tightened. "That was headquarters. They've caught wind of our unusual patient and want a full report. And," he hesitated, glancing at Abigail, "Dr. Victor Harmon is on his way." Abigail's hands stilled on the ultrasound controls. "Victor? What business does he have here?" "Apparently, Shadow is part of his tracking study. He says he has critical information about the bear's history." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the steady beep of the monitoring equipment. Abigail's relationship with Victor Harmon stretched back decades, a complicated professional rivalry marked by fundamentally different approaches to wildlife management. Where she prioritized individual animal welfare alongside conservation, Victor's research often treated animals as data points in service of broader population studies. "Well then," Abigail said finally, "we'd better figure out as much as we can before he arrives." The next hour passed in methodical examination. Blood samples were drawn, wounds cleaned and assessed, vital signs monitored with careful attention. Shadow remained unconscious, the powerful sedatives ensuring he wouldn't wake during these critical moments of care. Emily discovered something troubling as she shaved a patch of fur to treat a wound on Shadow's shoulder. "Doctor." "Whitmore, look at this." Beneath the fur lay a circular scar, approximately an inch in diameter with signs of recent inflammation. "This isn't natural. It looks like a surgical site." Abigail examined the area carefully. "Someone's implanted something under his skin, recently judging by the inflammation." "A tracking device?" Scott suggested. "Perhaps," Abigail said, "but most approved wildlife trackers don't cause this kind of reaction." She made a note on Shadow's chart. "We'll need to investigate this further." The most pressing concern remained the cub. Additional ultrasound examination revealed it was severely dehydrated but otherwise appeared uninjured. The question of how to proceed loomed large. Attempting to remove the cub would risk both lives, but leaving it where it was couldn't be a long-term solution. "I've never seen anything like this," Emily admitted, studying the images. "It's almost as if his body created a protective pouch." "The cub isn't in the stomach proper. It's in some kind of modified space that's keeping it safe." Abigail nodded slowly. "Bears are capable of remarkable physiological adaptations, especially before hibernation. Perhaps Shadow somehow modified his own anatomy in response to an extreme situation." A commotion at the entrance interrupted their discussion. Victor Harmon strode into the medical center with the confidence of a man accustomed to deference. At 65, he cut an imposing figure. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a full head of silver hair and piercing blue eyes that missed nothing, he carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive and well-used. "Abigail," he acknowledged with a nod that fell just short of respectful. "I see retirement hasn't claimed you quite yet." "Victor," she replied evenly, "I understand this bear is of particular interest to your research." "Indeed." He moved toward Shadow without waiting for permission, his gaze clinical and assessing. "Shadow has been part of our behavioral study for 7 years, one of our most valuable subjects." Abigail watched him carefully. "Then perhaps you can explain the surgical implant in his shoulder, or the fact that he's somehow sheltering a live cub inside his body?" Victor stilled, something flashing across his face too quickly to interpret. "A cub? That's impossible. See for yourself." Abigail gestured to the ultrasound screen. Victor stared at the image, his professional composure momentarily shaken. "Extraordinary," he murmured, leaning closer. "Absolutely unprecedented." "What can you tell us about Shadow's history?" Scott interjected. "Anything that might explain this behavior?" Victor straightened, seeming to gather himself. "Shadow lost his mate 3 seasons ago, a female we had tagged as F217. She was killed by poachers in the northeast quadrant of the park. He's been solitary since then, which is typical for male grizzlies, but his movement patterns have been unusual." "Unusual how?" Abigail pressed. "He returns to the same meadow where she died, season after season. Most bears would establish new territory after such an event." Victor opened his briefcase, extracting a folder of documents. "Here's his tracking data for the past 3 years." As Abigail reviewed the maps and charts, Rebecca moved closer to Shadow, her photographer's eye drawn to details others might miss. "Look at his paws," she said quietly. "The pattern of calluses suggests he's been digging a lot." Nathan joined her. "Bears dig for food, den sites, or to recover something buried," Abigail finished, looking up from Victor's documents. "The meadow where Shadow's mate died, could there have been a den nearby, perhaps with cubs?" Victor shook his head. "F217 wasn't pregnant when she was killed. We'd have noted that in our records." A low groan from Shadow drew everyone's attention. The bear's massive paw twitched, his sedation beginning to lighten. "He'll need another dose soon," Emily warned, preparing the medication. Abigail moved to Shadow's head, placing a gentle hand on his muzzle. In that moment of connection, something shifted in her understanding, a recognition that transcended scientific explanation. This bear had sought them out deliberately, had chosen humans as his last hope. "The cub," she said suddenly. "We need to determine if it's related to Shadow or his mate. That might explain his protective behavior." "I can expedite DNA testing through my lab," Victor offered a little too quickly. "We have samples from F217 on file." Scott's phone buzzed and his face tightened as he read the message. "The park director wants a decision within the hour. Either we develop a viable treatment plan or he's ordering euthanasia for humane reasons." "Euthanasia?" Nathan protested. "After he sought help?" Protocol for severely injured wildlife, especially large predators, Scott explained grimly. We don't have unlimited resources and the liability issues. No, Abigail interrupted, her voice firm. I'm not putting this bear down until we understand what's happening here. There's something remarkable occurring, something that could change our understanding of these animals. Victor's expression remained neutral, but his eyes hardened. Sentimentality has no place in wildlife management, Abigail, you know that. This isn't sentimentality, she countered. It's scientific curiosity. A male bear protecting a cub defies everything we understand about grizzly behavior. That alone warrants further study. The standoff between the two veteran wildlife experts crackled with decades of professional disagreement. Finally, Victor inclined his head slightly. Very well. What do you propose? Abigail turned to Emily. We need to perform a more comprehensive scan. If the cub is in a stable position, we may be able to keep them both alive while we develop a surgical plan. As the team prepared the equipment, Nathan pulled Abigail aside. There's something you should know, he said quietly. When we found Shadow, he wasn't just wandering, he was heading directly toward the road, toward people, like he knew exactly where to find help. Abigail nodded slowly. Animals surprise us all the time with their intelligence. But this, she glanced back at Shadow's massive form. This feels different. The CT scanner, a recent donation from a wealthy park benefactor, hummed to life as they carefully positioned Shadow on the reinforced platform. The images that emerged confirmed Emily's theory. The cub was contained in a modified pouch-like structure that had somehow formed within Shadow's digestive tract, protected from digestive acids and receiving enough oxygen through the unusual arrangement of tissue. It's as if his body created a makeshift womb, Emily marveled, studying the scans. I've never seen anything like it. The cub can't survive like this indefinitely, Abigail noted, and Shadow's system is being taxed beyond sustainability. We need to separate them, carefully, surgically, if either is going to survive. Victor studied the images with a frown. The risk is enormous, for both of them. So is doing nothing, Abigail countered. The center fell quiet as everyone contemplated the unprecedented challenge before them. Finally, Scott broke the silence. I'll tell the director we need 48 hours. If you can present a viable surgical plan by then, with reasonable chance of success, I'll fight for authorization. Abigail nodded gratefully. Thank you, Scott. As the team dispersed to begin preparations, Abigail remained beside Shadow, her hand resting lightly on his massive head. In the quiet moment, she found herself whispering to him, "What happened out there? What made you trust us when everything in your nature says not to?" Shadow's breathing had steadied, his powerful body fighting despite the odds. Tomorrow would bring difficult decisions and unprecedented challenges. But for now, in the stillness of the medical center, an elderly veterinarian and a wounded bear shared a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between human and wild. The medical center grew quiet as evening settled over Yellowstone. Most of the staff had departed, leaving only the night team to monitor Shadow's condition. Abigail sat in her small office, surrounded by decades of research papers, worn textbooks, and framed photographs marking milestones in her career. She studied the CT scans spread across her desk, the impossible images of a male grizzly protecting a cub in a way that defied biological understanding. A gentle knock interrupted her concentration. Mason Turner stood in the doorway, a thick folder tucked under his arm and exhaustion lining his face. As Yellowstone's senior wildlife biologist, Mason had been tracking the park's grizzly population for over a decade. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, settling into the chair across from Abigail. "Scott filled me in on the basics, but I had to see for myself." Abigail pushed the scans toward him. "Have you ever seen anything like this in your research?" Mason shook his head, wonder and confusion mingling in his expression as he examined the images. Never. Male bears killing cubs is well documented. Protecting them goes against everything we understand about grizzly behavior. He looked up, his brow furrowed. But Shadow has always been different. Different how? Abigail leaned forward, sensing important context. Mason opened his folder, revealing years of tracking data, trail cam photos, and observation notes. We've been monitoring him for 7 years. Most male grizzlies establish dominance through aggression, particularly toward other males and cubs. Shadow never followed that pattern. He spread out several trail cam images showing the distinctive bear at various locations throughout the park. He's been solitary most of the time, except for a 3-year period when he paired with a female we designated F-217. Victor mentioned she was killed by poachers, Abigail said. A shadow crossed Mason's face. That's the official report. But something never sat right with me about that incident. He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. The location where she was found wasn't typical poaching territory, too close to ranger stations, too visible, and there were no obvious trophy parts taken. What are you suggesting? I'm not sure yet, Mason admitted. But Shadow's behavior changed dramatically after her death. See these movement patterns? He pointed to maps showing tracking data. He began returning to the same meadow where she died, month after month. We assumed it was territorial marking, but now... He trailed off, studying the medical scans again. Now you're wondering if he was searching for something, Abigail finished. Or someone. Mason pulled out one final photograph, a slightly blurry trail cam image showing Shadow digging intently at what appeared to be disturbed earth. This was taken 3 weeks ago, about 2 miles from where your hikers found him. Abigail studied the image, pieces beginning to connect in her mind. You think he found the cub there? But how could it have survived? Bears are known to cache food by burying it, Mason said. Perhaps F-217 had a cub that she hid before she was killed. It seems impossible, but hibernation physiology in bears allows for remarkable survival adaptations. The theory was tenuous at best, but it offered a starting point, a possible explanation for Shadow's unprecedented behavior. Abigail felt a chill run through her, remembering Victor's insistence that F-217 wasn't pregnant when she died. I need everything you have on F-217's death, she said, and I need to know more about Victor's research project. Mason's expression grew cautious. Victor Harmon has powerful connections in the research community and significant funding sources. His methods have been questioned before, but nothing has ever been proven. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, Abigail clarified. I just need to understand what might have happened to trigger Shadow's behavior. Their conversation was interrupted by Emily rushing into the office, her scrubs splattered with fresh blood. Doctor, Whitmore, you need to come now. Shadow's waking up and his vitals are spiking. Abigail hurried to the medical bay where Shadow lay. Despite the heavy sedation, the massive bear was showing signs of distress, increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, and muscle tremors running through his powerful frame. He shouldn't be conscious with the dosage we gave him, Emily said, preparing another syringe of sedative. Wait, Abigail placed a hand on Emily's arm. Look at the ultrasound. On the screen, the tiny cub was moving more vigorously than before, pressing against the walls of its unusual sanctuary. Shadow's movements seemed to be responding to the cub's distress rather than fighting the sedation. He's protecting it, Abigail whispered. Even now. She moved closer to Shadow's head, placing a gentle hand on his muzzle. Easy, big fellow. We're trying to help you both. To everyone's amazement, Shadow's eyes opened, just slightly, but enough to fix Abigail with a gaze of startling intelligence. A low rumble vibrated through his chest, not threatening but communicative. "Increase the IV fluids, but hold off on additional sedation," Abigail instructed. "I think the cub is dehydrated and hungry. Shadow is responding to its distress." Emily worked quickly to adjust the treatment. "How do we feed the cub while it's still inside him?" "We don't," Abigail said grimly, "which means we need to move up our timeline for surgery. The cub won't survive much longer in there, and Shadow is depleting his own resources trying to protect it." The double doors swung open as Nathan and Rebecca returned, carrying trays of coffee for the medical team. They froze at the sight of Shadow partially conscious. "Is he awake?" Rebecca asked, her voice hushed. "Semi-conscious," Abigail explained, "and showing remarkable awareness of the cub's condition." Nathan set down the coffee carefully. "We've been thinking about what you said, about needing to understand Shadow's history. Rebecca remembered something from our hike yesterday." Rebecca nodded eagerly. "Before we found Shadow, we passed through a meadow about 2 miles back. There was an area that looked recently disturbed. We thought it might be from elk or bison wallowing, but now I'm wondering if it was where Shadow was digging." "We could guide you there," Nathan offered. "First thing tomorrow." Abigail glanced at Shadow, then at the ultrasound showing the increasingly active cub. "The cub needs intervention soon, but understanding where it came from might help us save them both." She turned to Emily. "Can you maintain him overnight?" Emily nodded confidently. "We'll monitor them constantly. At the first sign of serious distress, we'll call you. Mason?" Abigail turned to the biologist. "I need you to pull every record of research projects involving bears in Yellowstone for the past 5 years, particularly anything connected to Victor Harmon's work." "That's a lot of data," Mason warned, "and some of it might be classified under research protections." "Then get me what you can," Abigail insisted. "There's more happening here than a bear with unusual behavior. I can feel it." As the night deepened, Abigail found herself unable to leave the medical center. She sent the others home with instructions to return early while she settled into a chair beside Shadow's massive form. The bear had slipped back into unconsciousness, but his breathing remained steady, his powerful presence filling the room even in repose. Abigail's thoughts drifted to her late husband, Thomas. He would have been fascinated by this case. He'd always believed animals possessed deeper cognitive abilities than science recognized. Their disagreements with Victor had begun decades ago over this very issue. Victor saw animals as biological machines responding to evolutionary programming, while Thomas insisted they possessed individual awareness, even forms of empathy. "You might have been right all along, Thomas," she whispered into the quiet room. Her gaze fell on Shadow's scarred muzzle, evidence of a long, hard life in the wild. Male grizzlies typically lived solitary lives, competing violently for territory and mating rights. The idea of one protecting a cub, possibly not even his own, challenged fundamental assumptions about bear behavior. A memory surfaced from early in her career, something Thomas had said after observing a mother bear with cubs. "What if our understanding of predator behavior is too limited by our own expectations? What if, in rare circumstances, even the rules of nature can be broken by something like love?" She had dismissed it as sentimentality then. Now, watching Shadow's massive chest rise and fall, she wondered if her late husband's intuition had touched on something science was only beginning to understand. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the windows. Abigail woke with a start, momentarily disoriented until she remembered where she was. Shadow's condition had stabilized overnight, but the ultrasound showed concerning signs. The cub's movements were weaker, its heart rate slightly elevated. Emily arrived first, bringing fresh coffee and determination. "Surgery today?" "We need to be ready," Abigail confirmed. "But first I want to see where Shadow came from. It might give us crucial information." Nathan and Rebecca arrived as promised, equipped for hiking and visibly eager to help. Scott joined them, his ranger uniform crisp despite the early hour. "The director's given us until tomorrow morning," he informed Abigail quietly. "After that, he wants a resolution, one way or another." "Then we'd better make today count," Abigail replied. As they prepared to depart for the meadow, Victor Harmon appeared at the center's entrance, immaculate in expedition clothing that looked barely worn. "I heard you're investigating the site where Shadow was found," he said smoothly. "I'd like to join you. My research team has equipment that might be useful." Abigail studied him carefully, noting the calculated interest in his eyes. "Of course," she said finally. "Any insight would be valuable." They left Emily in charge of Shadow's care, with strict instructions to call immediately if his condition changed. The hike to the meadow took just over an hour, following the same trail Nathan and Rebecca had used 2 days earlier. The meadow itself was a stunning example of Yellowstone's natural beauty, a wide, grassy expanse surrounded by lodgepole pines, with a small stream cutting through its center. In spring, it would normally be alive with new growth and wildlife. Today, it felt unnaturally quiet. "There," Rebecca pointed to an area of disturbed earth near a cluster of fallen logs. "That's where we noticed the digging." The group approached carefully. The disturbed area was significant, nearly 6 feet in diameter, with soil and vegetation scattered outward as if something had been frantically excavated. "Bear digging, definitely," Scott confirmed, examining the claw marks in the earth. "And recent." Victor knelt by the site, his expression unreadable as he studied the scene. "Interesting. This doesn't match typical food-searching behavior." "No," Mason agreed. "This is more deliberate, like he was looking for something specific." Abigail walked the perimeter of the disturbed area, her experienced eye noting details others might miss. Near the edge of the digging site, partially concealed by scattered dirt, she spotted something metallic. Carefully, she retrieved it with gloved hands, a small, cylindrical object roughly the size of a pencil eraser. "What is that?" Scott asked, moving closer. "I'm not sure," Abigail admitted, turning the object carefully. "Some kind of electronic component, perhaps from a tracking device." Victor's hand shot out, almost grabbing the object before Abigail could react. "That appears to be from one of our tracking implants." "May I?" Reluctantly, Abigail handed it over, noting the flash of relief that crossed Victor's face as he pocketed the component. "Standard wildlife tracker," he explained dismissively. "They occasionally malfunction and get expelled by the animal's body." Mason and Abigail exchanged a glance, both recognizing the improbability of this explanation, but choosing not to challenge it directly. The group continued examining the site, finding traces of blood, some old, some relatively fresh, and clear evidence that Shadow had spent significant time in this location. "Look at this," Nathan called from near the fallen logs. He pointed to a depression in the earth lined with dried grass and pine needles. "Is this a den?" Scott examined it carefully. "Too small for an adult bear, but the right size for a cub or young juvenile." Abigail felt a chill run through her as pieces began connecting in her mind. "Mason, you said F-217 died in this meadow." "Where exactly?" Mason consulted his GPS, then pointed to a spot approximately 30 yards from the digging site. "Records indicate it was right over there, near that large boulder." As they walked toward the boulder, Rebecca suddenly stopped, her photographer's eye catching something the others missed. "There's something buried here," she said, pointing to a slight mound covered with carefully arranged stones. Scott knelt beside the mound, gently moving aside the stones. Beneath them lay freshly turned earth, deliberately packed and shaped. "This isn't natural," he said quietly. "This is a burial." Victor stepped forward, his composure slipping slightly. "We shouldn't disturb wildlife burial sites. Some predators cache food for later retrieval." "This isn't a food cache," Abigail countered. "The stones are deliberately placed. That's intentional marking behavior." Making a difficult decision, Abigail nodded to Scott. "We need to see what's beneath." Carefully, Scott began removing the soil, digging no more than a few inches before uncovering matted fur. As they excavated further with painstaking care, the remains of a bear cub were revealed, long dead, but carefully positioned and protected from scavengers by the stone covering. "My God," Mason whispered. "He buried it." Abigail knelt beside the tiny remains, professional detachment warring with emotional impact. "This cub has been dead for months, possibly since last fall. And look," she pointed to distinctive markings on the small skull. "Blunt force trauma. This wasn't natural causes." Victor's face had paled slightly, his usual confidence replaced by something closer to anxiety. "We should report this to the proper authorities. Disturbing wildlife remains requires special permits." "We have the permits," Scott interrupted, his voice hardening as he studied Victor with new suspicion. "What we don't have is an explanation for why you claimed F-217 wasn't pregnant when she died." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Victor adjusted his stance, suddenly defensive. "Our records indicated she wasn't. Perhaps we were mistaken." Abigail stood slowly, decades of scientific objectivity temporarily set aside as she connected final pieces of a disturbing puzzle. "Or perhaps there's more to your research than you've disclosed, Victor." The tension was broken by Abigail's phone ringing urgently. Emily's voice came through, tight with concern. "Dr. Whitmore, you need to come back now. Shadow's condition is deteriorating rapidly, and the cub's vital signs are failing. Whatever you're going to do, it needs to happen today." "We're on our way," Abigail replied, already moving toward the trail. To the others, she called over her shoulder, "Scott, secure this site. Mason, bring samples from the remains. We need to confirm if this cub and the one Shadow is protecting are siblings." The return hike passed in tense silence, each person processing what they had discovered. Abigail's mind raced with implications and decisions. By the time they reached the medical center, she had formed a plan. Risky, unprecedented, but possibly the only chance to save both Shadow and the cub he had sacrificed so much to protect. The Yellowstone Wildlife Medical Center had never faced a challenge like this. As Abigail burst through the doors, Emily met her with charts showing Shadow's rapidly declining condition. The massive bear's temperature had dropped dangerously, his breathing shallow and labored. On the ultrasound monitor, the tiny cub moved weakly, its own life force diminishing by the hour. "We're losing them both," Emily said, her professional composure cracking slightly. "The cub is severely dehydrated, and Shadow's body is shutting down from the physiological stress." Abigail studied the monitors, decades of experience guiding her assessment. "Prepare the surgical suite. We need to intervene now." As the team mobilized with practiced efficiency, Nathan and Rebecca stood uncertainly at the edge of the activity. "Is there anything we can do?" Nathan asked. Abigail glanced up from her preparations. "Actually, yes. We need to document everything. Photographs, video, detailed notes. This case will challenge everything we understand about bear behavior. We need irrefutable evidence." Rebecca nodded, her photographer's instincts engaging. "I'll handle the visual documentation." "And I'll manage the narrative records," Nathan added, pulling out a notebook. Mason arrived moments later, having secured samples from the buried cub for DNA analysis. "I've called in a favor at the university lab. They can run expedited tests, but it will still take hours." "We don't have hours," Abigail replied grimly. "We need to operate now." Victor Harmon entered the center last, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something closer to agitation. "I must insist on being present for any procedures." As the primary researcher, as the veterinarian of record, I have final authority on medical interventions, Abigail interrupted, fixing him with a stern gaze. You're welcome to observe, but this is my operating room. The underlying tension between them crackled in the air, decades of professional disagreement crystallizing in this moment of crisis. Finally, Victor inclined his head in reluctant acquiescence. Very well, but I must register my formal concern about proceeding without complete information. Scott, who had remained silent during this exchange, stepped forward. I've just received authorization from the park director. Dr. Whitmore has full discretion to proceed as she deems medically necessary. His expression made it clear whose side he had chosen. As the team prepared for surgery, Abigail found a quiet moment to collect her thoughts. At 70, with retirement looming, this would likely be her final major procedure, a fitting culmination to a career dedicated to wildlife medicine. The irony wasn't lost on her that this case, her last, would be her most challenging and potentially significant. Emily approached with Shadow's latest blood work. His system is showing signs of internal hemorrhaging. Whatever he did to create that protective space for the cub, it's compromised his own physiology. Bears are incredibly adaptable, Abigail noted, studying the results. Their bodies undergo massive changes before hibernation, redirecting blood flow, modifying organ function. Shadow somehow triggered similar adaptations to protect the cub. But why? Emily asked, the scientific puzzle clearly troubling her. Everything we know about male bears suggests he should have killed the cub, not protected it. Abigail's thoughts turned to the small grave they'd discovered. Perhaps he's experienced loss before. Animals, especially those with higher cognitive functions, can develop complex responses to trauma. Their conversation was interrupted by increasing activity on Shadow's monitors. His massive heart was showing signs of arrhythmia, the powerful muscles struggling to maintain function under extraordinary stress. We need to begin now, Abigail announced, moving toward the surgical scrub station. As the team prepared for the unprecedented procedure, word had spread throughout the Park Service. Staff members not directly involved found reasons to pass by the observation windows, eager to witness this extraordinary case. Even the usually stoic rangers appeared moved by Shadow's plight. The surgical plan was complex, developed through hurried consultation between Abigail and Emily. They would need to carefully extract the cub without damaging the unusual protective pouch Shadow's body had formed, then repair the bear's internal physiology to give him a chance at recovery. The biggest risk is blood loss, Abigail explained as she marked the incision site on Shadow's shaved abdomen. His circulatory system has been rerouted to accommodate this unusual adaptation. We're essentially reversing a process we don't fully understand. Emily nodded, arranging specialized instruments designed for large wildlife surgery. I've prepared 10 units of synthetic blood expander. It's all we have. The atmosphere in the operating room grew solemn as the team donned surgical gear. Shadow lay unconscious on the reinforced table, his massive form dwarfing the human figures around him. Despite sedation, his breathing occasionally hitched when the ultrasound showed the cub moving, as if some part of him remained aware of his precious cargo. Let's begin, Abigail said quietly, making the first incision. The procedure progressed with tense precision. Shadow's unique anatomy presented challenges no veterinary textbook had prepared them for. The protective pouch had formed through a remarkable adaptation of his digestive tract, creating a safe space isolated from digestive acids and connected to the bear's blood supply through an intricate network of vessels. It's like his body repurposed part of the stomach lining, Emily marveled, carefully navigating the unusual structure. I've never seen anything like this. Nature finds a way, Abigail murmured, her focus absolute, as she worked to access the cub without disrupting vital systems. In the observation area, Nathan documented every detail while Rebecca captured photographs through the glass. Victor paced restlessly, his expression shifting between scientific fascination and poorly concealed anxiety. 2 hours into the surgery, they reached a critical juncture. The cub was visible now, small and vulnerable within its unusual sanctuary. Extracting it without causing catastrophic bleeding would require perfect precision. "Clamp ready," Emily said, positioning the instrument. "Extracting now," Abigail responded, her hands steady despite her age. With painstaking care, she lifted the tiny cub from Shadow's body, a female no more than a few weeks old, eyes still sealed shut. The moment felt sacred somehow, this improbable rescue defying everything science understood about wildlife behavior. Emily quickly wrapped the cub in a warming blanket, checking vital signs. "She's alive," she announced, relief evident in her voice. "Dehydrated and underweight, but alive." A collective exhale passed through the room, but the most dangerous part of the procedure remained, repairing Shadow's internal anatomy to give him a chance at survival. Blood pressure dropping, warned the monitoring technician. Heart rate becoming erratic. Abigail worked with focused intensity, suturing damaged vessels and tissue. "More blood expander," she directed, "and increase oxygen flow." Shadow's massive body shuddered suddenly, a tremor running through muscles powerful enough to crush a human skull. The monitors began to alarm as his vital signs plummeted. "He's crashing," Emily called out, moving to assist. Cardiac rhythm becoming chaotic. "Preparing cardiac stimulant," another team member announced. Abigail never looked up from her work, her hands moving with the precision born from decades of experience. "Not yet. His system is different from a human's. The stimulant could push him into complete arrest." Instead, she completed the final critical sutures with remarkable speed, then placed both hands directly on Shadow's heart, applying gentle pressure in a rhythm that matched what she knew of healthy bear cardiac function. "Come on," she whispered. "You've fought too hard to give up now." For a terrible moment, the operating room fell silent except for the ominous drone of flatlining monitors. Then, beneath Abigail's experienced hands, Shadow's heart gave a powerful contraction, followed by another, and another, finding its rhythm once more. "We have regular sinus rhythm," the technician confirmed, wonder in her voice. "Blood pressure stabilizing." Abigail completed the closure methodically, her focus unwavering despite the perspiration visible on her brow. Only when the final suture was placed did she step back, removing her surgical mask with hands that showed the slightest tremor. "Now we wait," she said quietly. As the team moved Shadow to recovery, attention shifted to the tiny cub now fighting her own battle in a specialized incubator. Emily had inserted a feeding tube and was administering fluids and nutrients with careful precision. "She's responding," Emily reported cautiously, "but she's very weak." Abigail examined the small creature, noting details that spoke volumes to her experienced eye. The coloration pattern around her ears matches photographs of F217, and look at the unusual marking on her left paw, identical to Shadow's. "You think she's actually their biological cub?" Mason asked, peering at the tiny form. "It would explain his extraordinary behavior," Abigail replied. "But we need the DNA confirmation." The hours following surgery passed in a vigilant haze. Abigail refused to leave, monitoring both patients with unwavering attention. Shadow remained unconscious, his powerful body fighting for survival. The cub, whom the staff had begun calling Hope, showed small signs of improvement, responding to treatments with the resilience characteristic of her species. Late that evening, Mason burst into the recovery room, waving a printout from the university lab. "DNA results just came in," he announced breathlessly. "The cub Shadow was protecting and the buried cub we found are siblings, and both are offspring of Shadow and F-217. Abigail absorbed this confirmation of her theory, the scientific implications profound. F-217 must have been pregnant when she died. The official record was wrong. Victor, who had remained in the observation area throughout the day, appeared visibly uncomfortable at this revelation. "Records can be mistaken," he offered weakly. "Or deliberately falsified," Scott suggested, his ranger's instincts for investigation evident in his tone. The tension was interrupted by movement from the incubator. Tiny Hope had begun squirming more vigorously, her minute paws flexing as she sought comfort. "She needs her mother," Emily observed sadly, "or any parental figure." Abigail studied Shadow's unconscious form, considering possibilities that crossed conventional boundaries of wildlife medicine. Making a decision, she carefully lifted the incubator. "What are you doing?" Victor demanded, suddenly alert. "Something unorthodox," Abigail replied calmly, placing the incubator near Shadow's massive head, close enough that the bears could sense each other's presence, but with safety barriers intact. Bears have an extraordinary sense of smell. Even unconscious, he may register her scent. Victor started to object, but fell silent as something remarkable happened. Shadow's breathing pattern changed subtly, his massive nostrils flaring as he detected the cub's scent. A low rumble, not quite a growl, more like a purr, emanated from deep in his chest. In the incubator, Hope responded immediately, turning toward the sound with increased movements. Her tiny body seemed to relax, as if recognizing safety. "That's impossible," Victor muttered, scientific certainty visibly shaken. "And yet, we're witnessing it," Abigail replied softly. The night passed with the medical team working in shifts, monitoring both bears with careful attention. By morning, Hope had shown significant improvement, taking formula through her feeding tube and demonstrating stronger vital signs. Shadow remained critical but stable, his powerful constitution fighting for survival. As dawn broke over the park, Ranger Scott entered the medical center with a troubled expression. "We have a situation," he announced quietly to Abigail. "The park director is on his way with representatives from the Department of Interior. Victor has filed a formal complaint claiming unauthorized interference with his research subjects." Abigail straightened, fatigue momentarily forgotten. "On what grounds?" "He's alleging that Shadow and the cub are part of a long-term behavioral study with significant funding and governmental oversight. He wants them transferred to his research facility immediately." "That's preposterous," Mason interjected. "Shadow is wild, not a research subject, and after what we discovered yesterday—" "What exactly did you discover?" The question came from the entrance, where the park director stood flanked by two official-looking individuals in suits. Behind them, Victor Harmon wore an expression of calculated confidence. Abigail stepped forward, her petite frame somehow commanding despite her age. "Director Williams," she acknowledged with a nod. "We've made several significant discoveries regarding Shadow's behavior and condition. Most importantly, we've successfully extracted a living cub that he was protecting, a biological offspring that, according to Dr. Harmon's records, shouldn't exist." Director Williams, a career bureaucrat with more political than scientific background, looked uncomfortable. "Dr. Whitmore, while your emergency intervention was authorized, the ongoing care falls under different jurisdictions. Dr. Harmon's research has federal funding and protection. Research that may have directly contributed to the death of a protected species," Scott interjected, his ranger's commitment to conservation evident. "We found evidence suggesting F-217's death wasn't caused by poachers as reported." Victor stepped forward, his composure slipping slightly. "These are serious and unfounded allegations. My research has all necessary approvals and has advanced our understanding of bear behavior significantly." "Then you won't mind explaining this," Mason said, producing a small evidence bag containing the metallic device they'd found in the meadow. This is not a standard tracking implant. It's an experimental device designed to deliver timed hormone injections, something that would require special approval from the ethics committee, which I confirmed last night was never granted. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Director Williams looked sharply at Victor, whose confident facade began to crack. "The advancement of science sometimes requires pushing boundaries," Victor said defensively. "Everything I've done has been to understand and ultimately protect these animals." "By experimenting on them without oversight?" Abigail challenged. "By potentially causing the death of a pregnant female and orphaning her cubs?" The confrontation was interrupted by a sudden change in the monitoring equipment. Shadow's vital signs had begun to strengthen, his massive body showing signs of returning consciousness despite the heavy sedation. "Everyone needs to step back," Emily warned, moving to check the bear's restraints. "He's waking up much faster than expected." The room tensed, the immediate danger of a 800-pound predator regaining consciousness temporarily overriding the human conflict. But rather than showing aggression, Shadow's first movement was to turn his massive head toward the incubator where Hope lay, his nostrils flaring as he sought her scent. The tiny cub responded in kind, becoming more active as she sensed his presence. The connection between them, defying scientific explanation, yet undeniable to anyone witnessing it, created a powerful silence in the room. Director Williams was the first to speak. "I think," he said carefully, "we need to reconsider our approach to this situation." The morning sun filtered through the windows of the medical center's conference room, where an impromptu hearing had been convened. Director Williams sat at the head of the table, flanked by representatives from the Department of Interior. Abigail, Scott, Mason, and Emily formed a united front on one side, while Victor sat alone on the other, his usual confidence diminished but not extinguished. "Let's review what we know," Director Williams began, shuffling through the hastily assembled reports. At 62, Williams had spent most of his career navigating the bureaucracy of park management, rarely involving himself directly in wildlife matters. Today, however, the situation demanded his personal attention. Dr. Whitmore performed emergency surgery on a male grizzly designated as Shadow, extracting a living cub that, according to Dr. Harmon's previous reports, shouldn't exist. DNA testing confirms the cub is the biological offspring of Shadow and female F217, Mason added, sliding the laboratory results across the table. The same testing shows the deceased cub we found buried at the meadow site was also their offspring, likely a sibling from the same litter. Williams frowned, turning to Victor. "Your research records indicated F217 was not pregnant when she died." Victor shifted uncomfortably. "A misclassification. Wildlife monitoring isn't an exact science, especially from a distance." "This was more than a distant observation," Scott countered, his ranger's training evident in his methodical presentation of evidence. "Your team performed a field examination of F217 after her death. An experienced researcher wouldn't miss signs of pregnancy. Furthermore," Abigail interjected, "we found this." She placed a sealed evidence bag on the table containing the small metallic device. "Our preliminary analysis suggests this is part of an experimental hormone delivery system, not a standard tracking implant. It appears to have been surgically implanted in Shadow and likely in F217 as well." The Interior Department representatives exchanged concerned glances. "Dr. Harmon," one asked, "did your research protocols include hormone manipulation of wild bears?" Victor's composure cracked further. "My research focuses on controlling aggressive behavior in predator species. The potential applications for conservation are significant. Applications that would be quite profitable for certain pharmaceutical interests," Mason noted, producing additional documentation. "I found these partnerships listed in your grant applications. Companies developing behavioral modification drugs for both animals and humans." Director Williams leaned forward, his expression hardening. Were these experimental devices approved by the Ethics Committee? The damning silence that followed provided answer enough. My work has always been for the advancement of science and conservation, Victor finally said, his voice tight. Sometimes progress requires pushing beyond conventional limitations. Not at the expense of protected wildlife, Scott replied firmly. The tension in the room was interrupted by Emily rushing in, her scrubs wrinkled from hours of continuous work. "Shadow's fully conscious," she announced, "and he's responding to the cub in ways we've never documented before." The meeting adjourned as everyone moved quickly to the recovery area. Through the observation window, they witnessed an extraordinary scene. Shadow, now awake though weakened from surgery, lay on his reinforced platform with his massive head turned toward the incubator containing Hope. The tiny cub, sensing his presence, had pressed herself against the clear wall separating them, as close to him as the barriers would allow. "He's been making these vocalizations," Emily explained, indicating the low, rhythmic rumbles emanating from the bear. "They're not aggressive sounds. They're almost like, well, like he's talking to her." Abigail studied the pair with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades observing wildlife. "Those are maternal comfort sounds," she said quietly, "typically only heard from female bears with cubs." Even Victor appeared momentarily transfixed by the scene, scientific curiosity temporarily overriding his personal concerns. "Male bears don't vocalize to cubs that way," he murmured. "They just don't." "And yet, we're witnessing it," Abigail replied, deliberately echoing her words from the previous day. Director Williams cleared his throat. "Dr. Whitmore, what is your medical assessment? Can the bear survive his injuries?" Abigail considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would significantly impact decisions about Shadow's fate. "His constitution is remarkable. The surgery was successful, but he's lost a lot of blood and his system has undergone extraordinary stress. With proper care, I believe he has a 60–70% chance of recovery." "And the cub?" "Improving hourly," Emily reported. "She's taking formula now and showing more activity, but she's still very young. In the wild, she would be completely dependent on her mother for at least another year." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "Given the circumstances, I'm placing both animals under protective custody pending a full investigation into Dr. Harmon's research activities." He turned to Victor with a grim expression. "All your research permits are suspended effective immediately. The department will be conducting a comprehensive review." Victor's face flushed with anger. "You can't just—" "I can, and I have," Williams interrupted firmly. "Rangers will be securing your research facilities within the hour. I suggest you cooperate fully." As Victor stormed out, the atmosphere in the room lightened perceptibly. Scott turned to Williams. "What about Shadow and the cub? The medical center isn't equipped for long-term rehabilitation." "One step at a time, Ranger Anderson," Williams replied. "For now, they stay here under Dr. Whitmore's care." Throughout the day, Shadow continued to improve, his remarkable resilience becoming evident with each passing hour. Though still weak from surgery, he remained focused on the cub, responding to her movements and sounds with an attentiveness that defied conventional understanding of bear behavior. Late that afternoon, Abigail made a controversial decision. After consulting with Emily and ensuring multiple safety protocols were in place, she authorized a controlled interaction between Shadow and Hope. With rangers standing by with tranquilizer guns and barriers positioned for quick deployment, the incubator was carefully opened within Shadow's reach. "This goes against every wildlife management protocol," Mason whispered, watching tensely from behind the safety glass. "Sometimes protocols need to evolve based on new observations," Abigail replied, never taking her eyes off the bears. Shadow remained perfectly still as Emily gently placed the tiny cub on a padded surface near his massive paw. For a breathless moment everyone watched, poised to intervene at the first sign of aggression. But instead of the violence that would be expected from a male bear encountering a vulnerable cub, Shadow delicately extended one massive paw, creating a protective barrier around Hope's tiny form. The cub responded immediately, pressing against his fur and emitting a small squeak that seemed impossibly loud in the silent room. Shadow lowered his huge head, gently sniffing the cub, then began making the same soothing rumbles they had heard earlier. "He's comforting her," Rebecca whispered, capturing the historic moment with her camera. "Or she's comforting him," Abigail suggested quietly. The interaction continued for 10 carefully monitored minutes before Emily returned Hope to her incubator. Shadow watched intently as she was moved, his eyes following her with unmistakable awareness. As the day progressed, news of the extraordinary case spread throughout the Park Service and beyond. Local media picked up the story, focusing initially on the dramatic rescue of a bear seeking human help. By evening, Shadow and Hope had become minor celebrities, their story touching something deep in the public consciousness. Nathan, who had been managing social media updates with the park's approval, reported an overwhelming response. "People are captivated by this story," he told Abigail as they shared a quick dinner in the break room. "The idea of a father bear protecting his cub? It's challenging assumptions and resonating with people on an emotional level." "The story's gone national," Rebecca added, scrolling through her phone. "Major networks are requesting interviews and footage." Abigail shook her head, uncomfortable with the attention. "Our focus needs to remain on their recovery, not publicity." As night fell over Yellowstone, the medical team established a rotation for monitoring the bears around the clock. Abigail, despite Emily's insistence that she rest, took the first watch. She sat in the dim recovery room, reviewing Shadow's latest vital signs with the meticulous attention that had defined her career. "You're quite the rebel, aren't you?" she said softly to the massive bear. "Breaking all the rules we thought we understood about your kind." Shadow's eyes opened at the sound of her voice, his gaze finding her with startling directness. In that moment of connection, Abigail felt the weight of her 70 years, the decades of work with wildlife, the countless animals saved and lost, the accumulated knowledge that still somehow failed to explain what she was witnessing. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas and the theories he had proposed before his death 15 years ago. Ideas about animal cognition and emotional capacity that had been dismissed as anthropomorphism by the scientific community, Victor Harmon chief among the critics. "Thomas saw something in your kind that others missed," she told Shadow quietly. "Something beyond instinct and biological programming." A light knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Mason entered with a grim expression that immediately put Abigail on alert. "What's happened?" she asked, rising from her chair. "We've been reviewing the records seized from Victor's research cabin," he said, keeping his voice low. "Abigail, there's something you need to see about Thomas's accident." She felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "What about it?" Mason hesitated, clearly struggling with how to present the information. "The location where Thomas's hiking accident occurred 15 years ago. It's the exact same meadow where F-217 died, and according to Victor's records, he was conducting field research there on the same day Thomas was killed." The implications hung in the air between them, too serious to voice directly without more evidence. "Thomas was investigating unusual bear behavior that day," Abigail recalled, her voice barely audible. "He told me he was following up on something concerning about Victor's methods." "There's more," Mason continued reluctantly. "Victor's experimental hormone treatments were designed to increase aggression in male bears during certain trigger situations. He was testing theoretical applications for military and law enforcement use." Abigail's gaze drifted to Shadow, understanding blooming with terrible clarity. So, a bear that should have been aggressive toward a cub might instead protect it if the hormone delivery malfunctioned or was incorrectly calibrated, Mason finished. The opposite effect of what was intended. The revelation settled over Abigail like a physical weight. If Victor's experiments had inadvertently caused Shadow to protect rather than harm his offspring, what other unintended consequences might have occurred? Could Thomas's accident have been the result of a bear's manipulated behavior? Her contemplation was interrupted by alarms from Hope's incubator. The tiny cub had begun seizing, her small body rigid with convulsions. "Emily!" Abigail called sharply, rushing to the incubator. "Something's wrong with Hope!" The younger veterinarian appeared instantly, as if she'd been waiting nearby. Together they worked to stabilize the cub, whose condition had deteriorated with frightening speed. "Temperature's spiking," Emily reported, administering medication through the cub's IV line. "Possible infection or reaction." Shadow, sensing the distress, began straining against his restraints, his powerful muscles tensing despite his weakened state. The monitoring equipment attached to him sent its own cascade of alarms as his heart rate and blood pressure surged dangerously. "We're going to lose them both if we can't stabilize them," Emily warned. Dividing her attention between the two patients, Abigail made a split-second decision based on instinct rather than protocol. "Bring her to him," she directed. "What? That's too risky in his agitated state." "Trust me," Abigail insisted. "I've observed their connection. It's our best chance for both of them." With careful precision, they moved the convulsing cub to a position near Shadow's head. The massive bear immediately grew calmer, lowering his snout to gently touch the tiny form. His rumbling vocalizations resumed, deeper and more insistent than before. To the amazement of both veterinarians, Hope's seizures began to subside within minutes. Her tiny body relaxed, her breathing stabilized, and her vital signs gradually returned to safer levels. "I've never seen anything like this," Emily whispered. "It's as if he's healing her somehow." "Not healing," Abigail corrected gently. "Calming. Reducing her stress response enough to let the medication work." She studied the pair with wonder. "The connection between them transcends our medical understanding." Through the long night, Shadow and Hope remained together, the massive bear maintaining his protective position while the tiny cub nestled against his fur. By morning, Hope had stabilized completely, and Shadow's own vital signs had improved significantly. As dawn broke over Yellowstone, Abigail stood at the observation window, watching the improbable pair with a renewed sense of purpose. The revelations about Thomas's death and Victor's research had opened old wounds, but they had also provided an unexpected path forward. Director Williams arrived early, accompanied by a distinguished older woman Abigail recognized as the Regional Director for Wildlife Conservation. "Dr. Whitmore," Williams began formally, "this is Dr. Eleanor Simmons from the Conservation Authority. Given the unusual circumstances of this case, we've been discussing options for Shadow and the cub's long-term care." Dr. Simmons stepped forward, offering her hand. "Dr. Whitmore, your work here has been remarkable. I've reviewed the case files and I believe we're witnessing something unprecedented in documented bear behavior." "We have a proposal for you," Williams continued. "In light of your upcoming retirement and your unique connection with these bears, would you consider overseeing a specialized rehabilitation program? The department is prepared to establish a dedicated facility within the park boundaries." Abigail felt a surge of unexpected emotion. After decades of working within the system, often fighting for resources and battling institutional resistance, the offer represented a validation she had never anticipated. "What exactly would this entail?" she asked carefully. A controlled natural environment where shadow and hope can recover together, Dr. Simmons explained. A research and rehabilitation center that could advance our understanding of bear behavior while giving these particular animals their best chance at eventual reintroduction to the wild. And Victor's research? Abigail pressed. Williams's expression hardened. Under full investigation, the evidence you and Ranger Anderson uncovered has prompted a comprehensive review of all his work. If there's a connection to your husband's death, Abigail, we'll find it. Through the window, Shadow shifted position, curling his massive body more protectively around tiny Hope. The impossible bond between them, a male bear nurturing a cub he should by all scientific understanding have killed, represented both a mystery and a promise. I'll need complete autonomy in their care, Abigail stipulated, and I want Emily Wilson as my deputy director. Done, Williams agreed without hesitation. As plans were formalized throughout the day, Abigail found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. And retirement, which had loomed as an uncertain void just days ago, had transformed into an unexpected new chapter, one that honored Thomas's memory and carried forward his beliefs about animal cognition. That evening, as the medical center quieted for the night, Abigail sat beside Shadow's recovery platform, reviewing the day's developments with the bear as if he could understand every word. "We're going to build you and Hope a place where you can heal properly," she told him softly. "Somewhere safe, where you can show us everything we've been too blind to see about your kind." Shadow's dark eyes, intelligent and aware in a way that defied scientific explanation, held her gaze with unmistakable connection. In that moment, the boundary between human and animal, between science and something deeper, seemed to dissolve, revealing a shared understanding that transcended species. Outside the window, the first stars appeared above Yellowstone's ancient landscape. Somewhere in that darkness, the wild continued its timeless rhythms, indifferent to human interpretations, yet forever changed by human actions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in the quiet recovery room, an elderly veterinarian and a wounded bear had found an unexpected path forward, together. The transformation of Shadow and Hope captured hearts and minds across Yellowstone and beyond. 3 weeks had passed since the surgery, and both bears had shown remarkable progress. Shadow's massive body was healing, his strength returning day by day. Hope had nearly doubled in size, her tiny eyes now open and alert, taking in the world with the curious intensity of all young creatures. But on this cold morning, something had changed. Abigail arrived at the medical center earlier than usual, sensing a disruption in the routine they'd established. Emily met her at the door, face drawn with concern. "Shadow stopped eating last night," she reported, leading Abigail to the observation area. "His vitals are stable, but he's become lethargic, unresponsive, even to Hope." Through the glass, Abigail could see the massive bear lying motionless on his platform. Hope pawed at his fur, emitting small distress sounds that would normally elicit an immediate protective response. Today, Shadow remained still, his eyes half closed, breathing shallow. "Have you run blood tests?" Abigail asked, professional instincts taking over. Emily nodded, handing over a tablet with the results. "Everything points to an inflammatory response. Temperature elevated, white count rising, but we can't identify the source." Abigail reviewed the data with the practiced eye of decades in wildlife medicine. Something wasn't adding up. Shadow had been recovering steadily, his wounds healing without complication. This sudden decline suggested an underlying factor they'd missed. "Let's do a full scan," she decided. "There might be something we overlooked." As they prepared Shadow for comprehensive imaging, Mason arrived with news that added another layer of complexity to the situation. "The investigation into Victor's research has uncovered something disturbing," he said quietly, pulling Abigail aside. The hormone delivery devices he implanted were designed with a self-destruct mechanism if tampered with. Essentially, they release a slow-acting toxin if removed incorrectly. Abigail felt a chill run through her. And we removed one from Shadow during surgery. Without knowing its specifications, Mason confirmed grimly. The investigators found documentation at Victor's lab. He designed them this way to prevent competitors from reverse engineering his technology. That man's ego knows no bounds, Abigail muttered, anger flaring briefly before her medical training reasserted control. We need to identify the toxin and develop a treatment protocol immediately. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Shadow's condition continued to deteriorate as the team worked frantically to identify the substance attacking his system. Hope, sensing the crisis, became increasingly agitated, her distress adding emotional weight to an already tense situation. By mid-afternoon, Shadow's breathing had become labored, his powerful body racked with tremors. The scans revealed what they feared, a spreading inflammation emanating from the surgical site where they'd removed Victor's device. "We've identified the compound," Emily announced, rushing into the treatment area with results from the university laboratory. "It's a synthetic derivative of a neurotoxin designed to cause a slow, progressive shutdown of the central nervous system." "Is there an antidote?" Scott asked. The ranger had remained at the center throughout the crisis, his official duties temporarily delegated to deputies. Emily shook her head. "Not specifically, but the lab suggests a combination therapy that might counteract the effects. It's experimental, never tested on bears." "What are the risks?" Abigail asked, though she already knew the answer. "High," Emily admitted. "The treatment could accelerate the decline rather than reverse it." But without intervention, the unspoken conclusion hung heavily in the air. Without treatment, Shadow would certainly die. Abigail faced the kind of decision that had defined her career, balancing risk against certainty, weighing the chance of recovery against the reality of loss. At 70, with retirement technically just days away, she felt the weight of this moment with particular clarity. "Prepare the treatment," she instructed Emily. "I'll take full responsibility." As the team moved into action, Abigail found herself alone with Shadow. The massive bear's eyes opened briefly, finding hers with the uncanny awareness that had marked their connection from the beginning. "I know you understand more than science believes possible," she told him quietly. "We're going to fight for you, but you need to fight too. Hope needs you." At the mention of the cub's name, Shadow's ear twitched slightly, a small sign that somewhere beneath the growing paralysis he remained present and aware. The treatment began that evening, a carefully calculated combination of anti-inflammatory agents, neural protectants, and targeted medications designed to bind with the toxin's molecules. Shadow's massive size complicated the dosing, requiring adjustments based on Abigail's decades of experience rather than standard protocols. Through the night, the team maintained a constant vigil. Hope had been temporarily relocated to a separate enclosure despite her vocal protests, the treatment process too intense and unpredictable to risk her presence. Every hour brought new data, new adjustments, new moments of despair or cautious optimism. By dawn, Shadow's condition had stabilized, though remained critical. The progression of symptoms had slowed, but not reversed. Abigail, who had refused to leave despite Emily's insistence she rest, studied the latest readings with exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "He's fighting," she noted, indicating subtle improvements in neural response tests. "But the toxin has a strong foothold." Nathan and Rebecca arrived early, having spent the previous day documenting the developing rehabilitation facility at the park's northern edge. The construction had accelerated based on Shadow's earlier recovery trajectory, a cruelly ironic detail given the current crisis. "How can we help?" Nathan asked. The journalist's notepad absent for once, replaced by the simple presence of someone who cared. Abigail appreciated the sincerity in his question. Over the weeks, the couple had become more than documentarians. They had become advocates and friends, their initial chance discovery of Shadow evolving into a committed involvement with his care. "Talk to him," she suggested. "Read, play music, anything." Studies suggest auditory stimulation can maintain neural pathways even when other systems are compromised. Throughout that day, a rotation of voices filled Shadow's recovery room. Nathan read passages from Jack London's Wilderness Tales. Rebecca described photographs she'd taken of Yellowstone's spring awakening. Emily discussed Hope's development in technical detail, as if providing a medical update to a concerned parent. Scott recounted ranger stories from his decades in the park. And Abigail, when alone with Shadow during treatment adjustments, spoke of Thomas, of his theories about animal intelligence, his respect for the wilderness, his belief that humans had only begun to understand the cognitive and emotional lives of the creatures with whom they shared the planet. "He would have loved you," she told Shadow quietly during one such moment. "You're proving everything he believed about your kind." As evening approached, bringing with it the 36-hour mark since Shadow's decline began, a critical decision point loomed. The treatment showed minimal effectiveness, and Shadow's system couldn't sustain the stress indefinitely. Director Williams arrived for a direct assessment, his administrative demeanor softened by genuine concern. "Dr. Whitmore, I need your honest evaluation. What are his chances?" Abigail considered the question with the clinical detachment her profession demanded, while battling the emotional investment that had grown over these intense weeks. "Medically, less than 30%, she admitted. "The toxin is persistent, and his system is weakening. But," she hesitated, aware of how unscientific her next words would sound, "there's something about him, a will, a determination, that defies statistical prediction." Williams nodded thoughtfully. "And the cub? How dependent is she on him at this point?" "Physically, we can provide what she needs," Emily interjected. "Formula, shelter, basic care, but developmentally, psychologically, she's bonded to him in ways we don't fully understand. Bears are intelligent, social creatures despite their solitary reputation. Hope would survive without Shadow, but her development would be compromised." The director absorbed this information silently, his gaze moving from the monitors displaying Shadow's vital signs to the separate screen showing Hope in her temporary enclosure, still calling for her protector. "Continue treatment for another 24 hours, he finally decided. "After that, we'll need to reevaluate based on quality of life considerations." After he departed, Abigail and Emily exchanged a weighted glance, the unspoken reality hanging between them. If Shadow didn't show significant improvement within 24 hours, humane euthanasia would become the likely recommendation. "We should try one more thing," Emily suggested hesitantly. "It goes against protocol, but at this point, protocol hasn't exactly been our guiding star in this case," Abigail noted wryly. "What are you thinking?" "Bring Hope back in. Let them be together." The proposal carried obvious risks. Shadow's condition was unpredictable, his massive strength potentially dangerous even in his weakened state, but Abigail recognized the wisdom in Emily's suggestion. The connection between the bears had already defied scientific explanation. Perhaps it could once again. With careful preparations and safety measures in place, Hope was brought into Shadow's recovery area. The tiny cub's reaction was immediate, a series of soft vocalizations as she identified his scent, followed by determined movement toward his massive form. The team watched anxiously as she approached, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger, but danger never materialized. Instead, Hope climbed directly onto Shadow's foreleg, pressing her small body against his chest and continuing her gentle vocalizations. For several breathless moments, Shadow remained unresponsive, his condition apparently unchanged. Then, almost imperceptibly, his massive head shifted slightly toward the cub. A deep rumble emerged from his chest, the distinctive vocalization that had become his signature communication with Hope. On the monitors, his heart rate stabilized, neural activity showing subtle but significant changes. "He's responding to her," Emily whispered, the scientific detachment in her voice giving way to wonder. Through the night, Hope remained curled against Shadow's massive form, occasionally moving to nuzzle his face or paw gently at his fur. Each interaction seemed to produce a positive response in his readings, small improvements that individually meant little but collectively suggested a trend toward stabilization. By morning, Shadow's condition, while still serious, had definitively improved. The inflammation markers were decreasing, neural response tests showing better results. Most significantly, he had begun responding more actively to Hope's presence, his massive paw occasionally shifting to create a more secure space for her against his body. "The connection between them is actually facilitating his healing," Emily marveled, reviewing the overnight data. "It's like she's providing something our medicine couldn't." "Companionship," Abigail suggested quietly. "Purpose." When Director Williams returned for his promised evaluation, the improvement was sufficient to warrant continued treatment. Shadow wasn't out of danger, but the trajectory had shifted from steady decline to cautious recovery. The next 3 days brought steady progress. Shadow began taking small amounts of food, his awareness increasing incrementally. Hope remained constantly at his side, her presence seemingly accelerating his healing in ways medical science struggled to quantify. On the 4th morning, Abigail arrived to find Shadow fully alert, his dark eyes tracking movement around the recovery room with clear awareness. When she approached, he lifted his massive head in greeting, a gesture of recognition that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Welcome back," she said softly, reaching out to touch his scarred muzzle with the careful respect his wild nature deserved. Shadow's recovery accelerated from that point, his remarkable constitution reasserting itself once the toxin's effects began to recede. Within a week, he was able to stand and move carefully around the reinforced recovery space, always mindful of Hope's location, always protective of her presence. The media attention that had briefly waned during the crisis returned with renewed intensity as Shadow's recovery became public knowledge. The story had evolved from a simple wildlife rescue to something more profound, a narrative about connection, protection, and the complex emotional lives of creatures humans too often reduced to scientific classifications. Nathan, who had maintained careful documentation throughout, found himself in demand from major networks and publications. With Abigail's cautious approval, he provided limited access and information, always emphasizing the scientific significance over sensationalism. "People are connecting with this story on a deep level," he told Abigail one evening as they reviewed footage for an approved documentary segment. "It's challenging preconceptions about wildlife, about bears specifically. The idea that a father bear would protect rather than harm a cub, it resonates with something fundamental in human experience." "Thomas would say we're finally seeing what was always there," Abigail replied. "That our understanding of animal behavior has been limited by our own expectations and assumptions." As Shadow's health improved, attention turned toward the nearly completed rehabilitation facility. Designed under Abigail's exacting specifications, it featured a 5-acre natural enclosure with a flowing stream, numerous enrichment features, and specially designed observation areas that would allow monitoring while minimizing human interaction. "It's nearly ready for them," Scott reported during his daily visit. "The perimeter fencing exceeds all safety standards, and the natural features have been enhanced to provide optimal foraging and play opportunities." The mention of play prompted a smile from Abigail, who had witnessed Shadow's first tentative engagement with Hope beyond basic protective behaviors. The tiny cub, growing stronger and more coordinated daily, had begun initiating playful interactions, batting at his massive paws, pouncing on his tail, chewing gently on his ears. To the amazement of everyone, Shadow had responded with a gentleness that defied his powerful nature, carefully modulating his movements to accommodate her tiny size. "We're documenting behaviors never before recorded in male bears," Emily noted, reviewing the day's observations. "It's rewriting our understanding of their cognitive and emotional capacity." The investigation into Victor's research continued in parallel with Shadow's recovery. Evidence mounted of systematic ethical violations, unauthorized experimentation, and deliberate falsification of data. Most disturbing were the emerging connections to Thomas Whitmore's death 15 years earlier. Mason brought the latest findings to Abigail privately, aware of the personal impact they carried. "The records suggest Thomas had discovered Victor's unauthorized hormone experiments," he explained gently. "He was planning to report them to the ethics committee the day after his hiking accident." "And the accident itself?" Abigail asked, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. "Circumstantial but compelling evidence suggests Victor had been testing aggression-enhancing hormones on bears in that specific area," Mason replied carefully. "Thomas's injuries were consistent with a bear attack, but no bear was ever found or identified. The investigation at the time was cursory." Abigail absorbed this information with the composure of someone who had long suspected such truths. "Thomas always said Victor valued results over ethics. He was concerned about where that might lead." "The federal investigation is building a criminal case," Mason assured her. "Victor won't escape accountability this time." As Shadow continued to recover, plans progressed for transferring both bears to the rehabilitation facility. The logistics were complex. Moving an 800-pound predator and his vulnerable cub required meticulous planning and multiple contingencies. "We'll sedate him for the transfer," Emily explained during the final planning meeting. "Not deeply, just enough to reduce stress during transport. Hope will travel in a separate but connected carrier where he can sense her presence." The morning of the transfer arrived with a sense of both accomplishment and anxiety. Shadow had recovered remarkably from his near-death experience, though subtle changes in his movement suggested some permanent neurological effects from the toxin. Hope had continued to thrive, her growth and development tracking normal parameters for a cub her age. As the sedative took effect and Shadow's massive form relaxed, Abigail found herself experiencing an unexpected sense of transition. The bear's move to the rehabilitation facility marked the end of the acute medical phase of their journey and the beginning of a new chapter for all involved. "You've done something extraordinary here," Scott told her as they watched the transfer team carefully move Shadow onto the reinforced transport platform. "Changed how we understand these animals. Maybe changed how we approach wildlife management going forward." Abigail nodded thoughtfully. "Thomas used to say that true conservation means seeing animals as they actually are, not as we assume them to be. Perhaps that's Shadow's greatest gift to us, challenging our assumptions, expanding our understanding." The transport vehicles moved slowly through Yellowstone's winding roads, a small procession marking a significant journey. Upon arrival at the rehabilitation facility, Shadow was carefully positioned in the introduction area, a contained space where he could safely awaken and acclimate before accessing the larger natural enclosure. Hope, who had remained calm throughout the journey, was placed nearby in a protected space with a mesh barrier, close enough for Shadow to sense and see upon waking, but safely separated until his post-sedation response could be assessed. As the teams completed final preparations, Abigail stood quietly at the observation point, watching Shadow's breathing deepen and strengthen as the sedation began to wear off. After weeks of intensive medical intervention, seeing him in this more natural setting, surrounded by earth and trees rather than medical equipment, felt like witnessing a circle nearing completion. "Dr. Whitmore," Emily called softly from the monitoring station. "He's waking up." Shadow stirred slowly, his massive body shifting as consciousness returned. The sedation had been carefully calculated, enough to ensure safe transport but light enough to allow quick recovery. As his eyes opened, the first thing he registered was the absence of the familiar medical center scents, replaced by earth, pine, and fresh water. His head lifted, nostrils flaring as he took in his new surroundings. "Easy, big fellow," Abigail murmured from behind the reinforced observation panel. "Hope is right here." At the mention of the cub's name, Shadow's attention sharpened. He turned toward the adjacent enclosure where Hope waited behind the mesh barrier, already fully awake and pawing at the separation between them. A deep rumble emanated from his chest, the distinctive vocalization he reserved exclusively for the cub. Emily monitored his vital signs remotely, nodding with satisfaction. Heart rate normal, respiration good. No signs of transport stress. The rehabilitation facility's introduction area had been designed with careful attention to both safety and natural elements. Rather than sterile medical surfaces, Shadow found himself on packed earth scattered with pine needles, surrounded by rock formations and fallen logs that mimicked a natural den site. A shallow pool of fresh water gleamed nearby, and the subtle sense of the larger enclosure beyond promised space and freedom after weeks of confinement. "He's orienting well," Mason observed, his biologist's eye noting Shadow's methodical assessment of his new environment. "No signs of aggression or fear." After 30 minutes of careful observation, with Shadow now fully alert and showing clear interest in reconnecting with Hope, Abigail gave the signal to open the mesh barrier between them. The team watched with bated breath as the barrier slid slowly upward, creating an opening just large enough for the cub to pass through. Hope didn't hesitate. With the eager clumsiness of all young creatures, she scrambled through the opening and bounded directly to Shadow, climbing onto his massive foreleg with practiced ease. Shadow lowered his scarred muzzle to greet her, gently touching her small body, as if confirming her well-being after their separation. "Would you look at that?" Scott whispered, the ranger's typically stoic demeanor softening at the sight. Like a father greeting his child. The reunion complete, Shadow began a careful exploration of the introduction area, moving with the deliberate caution of a predator in unfamiliar territory. Hope remained close, occasionally wandering a few feet to investigate something interesting before rushing back to the security of his presence. Despite his still healing surgical site and the residual effects of the toxin, Shadow's movements showed remarkable coordination and strength. "I think we can open access to the main enclosure tomorrow," Abigail decided after an hour of observation. "He's stable and oriented, and the additional space will benefit his continued recovery." The rehabilitation facility had become more than just a wildlife recovery center in the weeks of its rapid construction. Fueled by the public interest in Shadow and Hope's story, funding had poured in from conservation organizations, private donors, and even corporate sponsors. What had begun as a modest rehabilitation space had evolved into a state-of-the-art research and education facility focused on bear behavior and conservation. The main enclosure encompassed 5 acres of natural Yellowstone habitat, enclosed by specialized fencing that ensured both safety and privacy. A flowing stream bisected the space, creating natural boundaries and providing essential water features. Carefully positioned observation blinds allowed monitoring with minimal human intrusion, while advanced cameras would document the bear's behavior for scientific study. That evening, as Shadow and Hope settled into their first night at the facility, Abigail lingered at the observation station, watching the massive bear create a resting area in the soft earth near a rock formation. With methodical care, he arranged pine branches and soil into a shallow depression, then settled into it with Hope nestled against his chest, a perfect mirror of wild bear behavior. "He's remembering," Emily observed, joining Abigail at the window. "Natural instincts reasserting now that he's in a more appropriate environment. But maintaining the bond with Hope," Abigail added. "That's the extraordinary part. In the wild, a male bear would never—" She let the thought trail off, the evidence before her eyes challenging decades of scientific understanding about bear behavior. In all her years of wildlife medicine, nothing had prepared her for the complex relationship developing between this adult male grizzly and the tiny cub he had nearly died to protect. As darkness fell over Yellowstone, the observation cameras switched to infrared, revealing Shadow and Hope still nestled together in peaceful sleep. Abigail finally allowed herself to be persuaded to leave for the night, accepting a ride from Scott back to her small cabin on the park's edge. "The director called today," Scott mentioned as they drove through the darkening landscape. "The federal investigation into Victor has expanded. They're revisiting Thomas's death as a potential homicide." Abigail stared out at the passing trees, emotions carefully contained beneath her professional exterior. "After 15 years, I'm not sure what they can prove." "Documents don't lie," Scott replied gently. And Victor kept meticulous records of his research subjects, including bears he exposed to experimental hormones. There's evidence he deliberately released an agitated bear in the area where Thomas was hiking. The possibility that her husband's death had been orchestrated rather than accidental settled heavily in Abigail's chest. Thomas had died doing what he loved, studying the wildlife of Yellowstone. But the thought that his death might have been preventable, might have resulted from a colleague's unethical actions, opened wounds she had thought long healed. "Would knowing for certain make a difference now?" she asked quietly. Scott considered the question carefully before answering. "Justice matters, Abigail, even delayed." They completed the drive in thoughtful silence, the stars emerging above Yellowstone's ancient landscape, the same stars that had witnessed countless dramas of life and death in this wilderness long before humans arrived to study and name them. Morning brought renewed energy and purpose. Abigail arrived at the rehabilitation facility early, eager to assess Shadow's condition after his first night in the new environment. She found him already alert, moving comfortably around the introduction area with Hope bouncing playfully at his heels. "He drank nearly 2 gallons of water overnight," Emily reported, reviewing the monitoring logs, "and consumed about 60% of the food provided. All good signs." Nathan and Rebecca arrived shortly after, equipment in hand for their approved documentation session. In the weeks since Shadow's surgery, their involvement had evolved from accidental discoverers to committed chroniclers, their photographs and articles helping to shape public perception of the extraordinary case. "How's our favorite family today?" Nathan asked, setting up his recording equipment at a respectful distance. "Ready for more space, I think," Abigail replied, watching Shadow test the boundaries of the introduction area with increasing interest. The larger enclosure beyond, visible through specialized see-through barriers, had clearly caught his attention. The decision to open access to the main enclosure came mid-morning after Shadow's medical checks confirmed his continued recovery. With the team positioned at strategic observation points, the connecting doorway was remotely opened, creating a 4-foot passage between the introduction area and the expansive natural habitat beyond. Shadow approached the opening with characteristic caution, his massive head lowering to examine the threshold carefully. Hope, less inhibited, darted forward as if to rush through. but a gentle rumble from Shadow stopped her in her tracks. The interaction demonstrated yet another aspect of their remarkable relationship. The adult bear was actively teaching the cub appropriate caution. After several minutes of careful assessment, Shadow finally stepped through the opening, his powerful body moving with deliberate grace despite his recent medical trauma. Hope followed closely, mimicking his cautious approach. Together they entered the larger enclosure, Shadow's nose continuously working to process the wealth of new information surrounding them. From the observation blind, Abigail and the team watched in professional satisfaction as Shadow conducted a methodical exploration of his new territory. He examined the stream crossing, tested various soil types, investigated rocky outcroppings, and identified optimal vantage points, all while maintaining constant awareness of Hope's location. Classic territorial assessment, Mason noted, recording observations on his tablet, but modified to account for the cub's presence. He's consistently choosing paths that would be manageable for her, avoiding terrain that would be too challenging. By afternoon, Shadow had completed a full circuit of the enclosure and selected a primary rest area, a natural depression beneath an overhanging rock formation that provided shelter, multiple escape routes, and a clear view of the approaching terrain. There, he and Hope settled into a period of rest, the cub nestled against his massive side in what had become their characteristic position. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Dr. Eleanor Simmons, who had arrived from the Conservation Authority to witness the transition. "In 40 years of bear research, I've never observed a male grizzly exhibiting parental behavior toward a cub, certainly not one he's not biologically related to." "But they are related," Abigail corrected gently. "DNA confirmed Hope is Shadow's biological offspring with F217. "Even so, Dr. Simmons persisted, "male bears typically show no paternal instinct. In fact, they're known to kill cubs to bring females back into estrus. This behavior contradicts everything in the scientific literature." Mason, who had been reviewing Shadow's medical files, looked up with a thoughtful expression. Unless Victor's hormone experiments had unintended consequences, the devices were supposed to increase aggression in specific situations, but if they malfunctioned, they might have altered his normal behavioral responses, Emily finished, the scientific implications dawning. Essentially rewiring instinctive reactions. Abigail considered this possibility, watching Shadow gently guide Hope away from a slippery section of the stream bank. Or perhaps our understanding of bear cognition has been too limited. Thomas always argued that we underestimated their capacity for individual behavioral variation. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Director Williams, accompanied by 2 federal investigators. Their expressions suggested significant developments. "Dr. Whitmore," Williams began formally, "these agents would like to speak with you regarding the investigation into Victor Harmon's research activities and their potential connection to Thomas Whitmore's death." The conversation that followed took place in the facility's small conference room, away from the peaceful scene unfolding in the bear enclosure. Agent Daniels, a serious woman with silver-streaked hair and precise movements, laid out the evidence they had uncovered with professional detachment. Dr. Harmon's research records indicate he was conducting unauthorized experiments with hormone-altering implants in the exact area where your husband was hiking on the day of his death, she explained. "Furthermore, we found communications suggesting he was aware Thomas had discovered his unethical practices and planned to report them." Agent Thompson, her younger colleague, continued, "Most damning is a deleted but recovered entry in Harmon's personal research log, dated the day of Thomas's death. It references eliminating a threat to the project and leveraging natural elements for plausible deniability." The clinical presentation of evidence related to her husband's 15-year-old death struck Abigail with unexpected force. She had long suspected Victor's involvement, but hearing the concrete details, the calculation, the deliberate exploitation of wild animals for lethal purpose, created a cold clarity that transcended mere suspicion. "Have you arrested him?" she asked, her voice steady despite the emotional undercurrent. "He was taken into custody this morning," Agent Daniels confirmed. Multiple charges, including research fraud, animal cruelty, and, pending further evidence, potential involvement in Thomas Whitmore's death. After the agents departed, Abigail found herself needing space to process this development. She walked to the most distant observation blind where she could watch Shadow and Hope without being observed by her colleagues. The tears, when they finally came, were not solely for Thomas or the years of uncertainty. They were for the complex tangle of relationships and consequences that had brought her to this moment. Shadow, unaware of the human dramas surrounding his existence, continued his careful exploration of the rehabilitation enclosure. Hope had grown bolder as the day progressed, venturing slightly farther from his protective presence, though always rushing back at any unfamiliar sound or movement. Their interactions displayed a remarkable balance of protection, instruction, and what could only be described as affection. Evening approached with golden light slanting through the pines, illuminating the peaceful scene below. Shadow had led Hope to the stream, where he demonstrated fishing techniques with surprising patience, swatting at the water with his massive paw, then allowing the cub to imitate his movements. When Hope successfully trapped a small fish against the bank, Shadow rumbled with what sounded remarkably like approval. Abigail, composed once more, rejoined the team at the main observation station. The day's emotional revelations had shaken but also clarified something important. The work here, with these bears, represented not just scientific advancement, but a form of justice and continuity. Thomas's theories about animal cognition and behavior, once dismissed by colleagues like Victor, were being vindicated through Shadow's extraordinary actions. "We should consider opening the visitor observation area next week," Director Williams suggested, reviewing the facility's development timeline. "Public interest remains high, and the educational opportunity is significant." The rehabilitation facility's design included a carefully positioned public viewing area, separated from the bears by multiple safety features, but offering limited visibility of certain parts of the enclosure. The educational component had been integral to securing funding, with a mission to transform public understanding of bear behavior and conservation needs. "I want to ensure Shadow and Hope are fully settled first," Abigail stipulated. "Their recovery and well-being remain our priority." "Of course," Williams agreed readily. "You retain final authority on all aspects of their care." As twilight deepened over Yellowstone, the team prepared to leave Shadow and Hope to their first night in the full enclosure. The monitoring systems would continue recording throughout the night, but the human presence would withdraw, allowing the bears to experience something closer to their natural rhythms. Abigail lingered at the observation window, watching Shadow guide Hope to the sheltered rest area he had selected earlier. With methodical care, he arranged the space, adjusting branches, testing the ground, creating a comfortable nest for the cub before settling his massive body as a protective barrier between her and the broader environment. "Sleep well," Abigail whispered, knowing the bears couldn't hear her but feeling the connection nonetheless. "Tomorrow brings new beginnings." The drive back to her cabin took her past familiar Yellowstone landmarks, now softened by gathering darkness. The park had been her home for decades, its rhythms and seasons interwoven with her own life's journey. Thomas had loved this wilderness with the same devotion he'd shown to her, a parallel passion that had defined their marriage and now, somehow, defined her unexpected new chapter. At 70, when most colleagues had long since retired to warmer climates and quieter pursuits, Abigail found herself embarking on perhaps the most significant work of her career. The Shadow and Hope Rehabilitation Center represented not just a facility for two remarkable bears, but a living laboratory that might transform scientific understanding of bear cognition and behavior. As she prepared for bed that night, her phone chimed with a message from Emily. "You should see this." Attached was night vision footage from the enclosure, showing Shadow carefully rearranging their sleeping nest, positioning Hope more securely against his side before placing his massive paw protectively over her tiny form. Watching the tender interaction, Abigail felt a sense of purpose that transcended personal grief or professional accomplishment. Whatever had caused Shadow's unprecedented behavior, whether hormonal alteration or some deeper unrecognized capacity in bear cognition, the result was undeniably meaningful. A male bear was protecting, nurturing, and teaching a vulnerable cub, defying scientific expectation and demonstrating capabilities previously unrecognized in his species. "Thomas was right," she whispered to the empty room. "We've only begun to understand them." Morning arrived with unexpected news. Mason called early, his voice tense with urgency. "Victor Harmon is dead," he reported without preamble. "Apparent suicide in his cell overnight." Abigail absorbed this information with complex emotions. Victor's death meant justice would remain incomplete in some ways. No trial, no public accounting for his actions, no full revelation of the truth about Thomas's death. Yet it also represented an ending, a closing of a painful chapter that had extended far too long. "The investigation will continue," Mason assured her. "His research records have been seized. The truth about what he did to the bears, to Thomas, will come out." When Abigail arrived at the rehabilitation facility, she found the team already reviewing overnight footage of Shadow and Hope. The bears had explored their enclosure under moonlight, Shadow teaching Hope nocturnal navigation skills with remarkable patience. They had fished in the stream, investigated scent markings, and practiced climbing on fallen logs, all normal bear behaviors, yet transformed by the unprecedented relationship between adult male and vulnerable cub. "Look at this sequence," Emily highlighted, isolating a particular segment of footage. "He's deliberately demonstrating scent-marking behavior, then waiting for her to imitate. When she does it correctly, he rewards her with physical affection." "Teaching methodology," Mason marveled. "I've seen mother bears do this, but never a male." The implications extended beyond this particular case. If Shadow's behavior represented previously unrecognized capabilities in male bears, whether naturally occurring or triggered by Victor's experimental hormones, it challenged fundamental assumptions about ursine cognition and social behavior. Director Williams arrived mid-morning with a media relations team and a carefully considered proposal. "The public interest in Shadow and Hope has created an extraordinary opportunity for conservation education," he explained. "We'd like to develop a limited documentary series with your oversight, Dr. Whitmore, professional filming, scientific integrity, no disruption to the bears." Abigail weighed the proposal thoughtfully. Her initial instinct had been to protect Shadow and Hope from public attention, to create a private space for their recovery and relationship to develop. But she also recognized the potential impact their story could have on conservation efforts and public understanding. "Limited access," she stipulated. "Scientific accuracy paramount, and all proceeds directed to bear conservation initiatives." "Absolutely," Williams agreed readily. "We've already established the Shadow and Hope Conservation Fund. The financial support will extend far beyond these two bears." As they finalized the arrangement, activity on the monitoring screens drew everyone's attention. Shadow had led Hope to a new section of the enclosure, where a fallen log spanned the narrow stream. With careful demonstration, he was showing her how to cross the natural bridge, first crossing himself, then returning to guide her tentative steps. "He's protecting her," but also preparing her for independence, Emily observed. The balance is remarkable. The insight resonated deeply with Abigail. All parenting, human or animal, involved this delicate balance, providing security while building capability, offering protection while encouraging growth. Shadow, despite having no evolutionary or social template for male parenting behavior, had somehow developed this nuanced approach to caring for Hope. Perhaps, she suggested quietly, we're witnessing something that has always been possible, but rarely manifests in the wild. Male bears typically don't encounter their cubs in circumstances that would trigger protective rather than aggressive responses. The coming weeks would bring new developments, new discoveries, and new challenges. The Shadow and Hope Rehabilitation Center would welcome limited public visitation, host scientific researchers from around the world, and continue documenting the extraordinary relationship developing between its namesake bears. For Abigail, the unexpected journey that had begun with a desperate bear seeking human help had transformed into something approaching a legacy, a validation of Thomas's theories, a contribution to scientific understanding, and perhaps, most meaningfully, a testament to the depth and complexity of non-human consciousness. As Shadow guided Hope through another fishing lesson in the stream below, Abigail felt a sense of completion that had eluded her since Thomas's death. Science had always been her anchor, her method for making sense of the world. But Shadow and Hope had revealed something beyond scientific classification, a capacity for connection that transcended species barriers and challenged human assumptions about the emotional lives of wild creatures. In the gathering twilight of her career, Abigail Whitmore had found an unexpected new beginning. And in the relationship between a massive grizzly and a tiny cub, she had discovered confirmation of what Thomas had always believed, that the natural world contained depths of intelligence, emotion, and connection that humans had only begun to comprehend. 1 year had passed since Shadow and Hope's remarkable journey began with a desperate encounter on a Yellowstone trail. The rehabilitation facility had evolved into a renowned research center, drawing scientists and conservation experts from around the world. The Shadow and Hope Conservation Fund had raised over $3 million for bear protection initiatives across North America, transforming a single rescue into a movement with lasting impact. Abigail stood at her favorite observation point, watching the bears in the morning light. Shadow's massive form moved with the fluid grace that had returned as his injuries healed, though subtle stiffness in his right hind leg remained a permanent reminder of his ordeal. At nearly 18 months old, Hope had grown from the tiny, vulnerable cub they'd extracted from Shadow's protective embrace into a healthy, juvenile bear with her mother's distinctive ear markings and her father's unusually dark fur. "They're thriving," Emily said, joining Abigail at the window. At 39, Emily had grown into her role as the center's lead veterinarian, her initial mentorship under Abigail evolving into full partnership. The latest cognitive tests show Hope's development is right on track despite her unusual upbringing. "And Shadow continues to surprise us," Abigail added, watching the massive bear demonstrate berry selection to his growing daughter. Their relationship had evolved as Hope matured, less protective hovering, more instructional interaction. Shadow allowed Hope to explore independently for longer periods, though he remained vigilant, his powerful presence never far from her adventures. The center's reputation had grown alongside its famous residents. What began as an emergency medical intervention had blossomed into a pioneering research facility dedicated to understanding bear cognition and behavior. The documentary series chronicling Shadow and Hope's journey had won prestigious awards and transformed public perception of these often misunderstood predators. "The board meeting starts in 30 minutes, Emily reminded gently. "They're expecting your final decision." Abigail nodded, her gaze still fixed on the bears below. At 71, retirement loomed once again, a prospect that felt both right and poignant. The Shadow and Hope Center represented the culmination of her life's work, a legacy that would continue long after she stepped away from daily operations. "I'll be there," she assured Emily, "just giving myself a few more minutes with them." The relationship between Shadow and Hope had challenged scientific understanding from the beginning. Male bears simply didn't raise cubs. Their evolutionary programming typically drove them to eliminate young bears to bring females back into breeding condition. Whether Shadow's unprecedented behavior resulted from Victor Harmon's experimental hormone treatments or represented a previously unrecognized capacity in bear cognition remained a subject of ongoing research and debate. The investigation into Victor's research had uncovered disturbing details about his methods and motivations. His hormone experiments had indeed been designed to manipulate aggression responses in predators, with potential military and pharmaceutical applications that went far beyond wildlife management. The evidence strongly suggested he had deliberately used a hormone-altered bear to eliminate Thomas Whitmore after Thomas discovered his unethical practices. Victor's suicide had prevented full justice through the courts, but the comprehensive investigation had restored Thomas's professional reputation and validated his theories about animal cognition. The Thomas Whitmore Memorial Research Grant now funded innovative studies exploring the emotional and cognitive capabilities of wild species, work that continued his legacy in ways Abigail found deeply meaningful. At the stream's edge, Shadow demonstrated a fishing technique with patient precision, his massive paw hovering above the water before striking with lightning speed to secure a trout. Hope watched attentively before attempting the move herself, her execution showing the refined coordination of practice and instruction. When she successfully caught a small fish, Shadow rumbled his distinctive approval, a sound researchers now recognized as unique to their interactions. "Time for your meeting," Mason called softly from the doorway, respecting Abigail's moment of reflection, but mindful of the waiting board members. With a final glance at the bears, Abigail turned toward her administrative responsibilities. The board meeting would finalize her transition to emeritus status and confirm Emily as the center's new director, changes Abigail had carefully orchestrated over the past months. At 71, she recognized the importance of ensuring the center's future beyond her direct involvement. The conference room overlooked the western edge of the bear enclosure, its large windows providing natural light and occasional glimpses of Shadow and Hope as they moved through their territory. Board members, a mix of scientists, conservation experts, and key donors, greeted Abigail with the respect her accomplishments had earned. "Before we begin the formal agenda," announced Charles Pearson, the board chairman, "we have a special announcement." He nodded to Director Williams, who stood with uncharacteristic emotion evident in his typically bureaucratic demeanor. "Dr. Whitmore," Williams began, "the Department of Interior, in conjunction with Yellowstone National Park, has approved the renaming of the meadow where Thomas Whitmore's life was taken. Effective next month, it will officially be designated as Whitmore Meadow, in recognition of both Thomas's contributions to wildlife science and your extraordinary career." The unexpected announcement momentarily overwhelmed Abigail's professional composure. The meadow had represented loss and painful questions for 15 years. Now it would stand as a permanent memorial, a reclaiming of painful ground for something meaningful and lasting. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the others in the room understood the significance behind those two words. The meeting proceeded with typical efficiency, covering operational updates, research developments, and financial reports. The Shadow and Hope Center had become financially self-sustaining through a combination of research grants, controlled educational tourism, and strategic partnerships with conservation organizations. When the agenda turned to Abigail's transition, she presented her formal recommendation for Emily Wilson's appointment as executive director, outlining the younger veterinarian's qualifications and vision for the center's future. The board's unanimous approval confirmed what had been carefully planned for months, a smooth succession that would maintain the center's mission while bringing fresh energy to its next chapter. "And now," Charles said, "the matter of Shadow and Hope's future." This topic represented the most complex challenge facing the center. Hope was approaching the age when bear cubs naturally began separating from their mothers in the wild. The question of whether she should be prepared for eventual release and what that would mean for her unusual relationship with Shadow had occupied countless discussions among the scientific team. The latest assessment suggests Hope has developed the necessary survival skills for potential wild release, Mason reported, reviewing the comprehensive evaluation. Shadow has been an extraordinarily effective teacher. She can fish, forage, scent-mark territory, and demonstrate appropriate caution toward potential threats. However, Emily added, their bond remains unique. Separating them permanently would cause significant stress to both bears, particularly Shadow, who has organized his entire existence around her care and protection. The unprecedented nature of their situation meant there was no established protocol to follow. Traditional wildlife management would suggest separating them to allow Hope to develop normal wild bear behavior, uncomplicated by her unusual upbringing. Yet the exceptional nature of their relationship and its scientific significance argued for maintaining their connection. "We've developed a compromise approach," Abigail explained, outlining the plan she and the scientific team had carefully constructed. "A graduated independence program that allows Hope increasing autonomy while maintaining connection with Shadow. The expanded northern section of the habitat would be Hope's primary territory, with controlled access points between the two areas." The proposal balanced multiple considerations: Hope's developmental needs, Shadow's well-being, scientific research opportunities, and ethical wildlife management. The board's discussion explored various perspectives before ultimately approving the approach, with provisions for ongoing assessment and flexibility as the bears' needs evolved. As the meeting concluded, Abigail found herself experiencing the bitter sweetness of transition. The center would continue without her daily presence, though she would maintain an advisory role. Shadow and Hope would begin a new phase in their remarkable journey, one that acknowledged their unique bond while supporting Hope's natural development. "You've built something extraordinary here," Nathan said, joining her as the board members departed. The journalist had maintained his connection to the center, his thoughtful documentation of Shadow and Hope's story helping to shape public understanding of bear behavior. "Something that will outlast all of us." Through the window they could see Shadow and Hope resting in the afternoon sun, the massive adult bear and the growing juvenile relaxed in each other's presence. Their relationship had defied scientific expectation from the beginning, a male bear protecting rather than harming a vulnerable cub, teaching rather than competing, nurturing rather than destroying. "Thomas used to say that our greatest limitations in understanding wildlife came from our own assumptions," Abigail reflected. "Shadow and Hope have certainly challenged those assumptions at every turn." Later that afternoon, Abigail made her final official rounds of the facility, saying goodbye to staff members who had become like family during the intense year of building and research. Her retirement would be partial. She would maintain her small cabin on the park's edge and continue advising on key research projects, but the daily responsibilities would transfer to Emily and her capable team. Her last stop was the observation area overlooking Shadow and Hope's evening activities. The bears had established consistent routines, their days structured around feeding, exploration, rest, and play. As twilight approached, they typically returned to Shadow's preferred resting area, the rock overhang that had been his first choice on arriving at the facility. Today, however, Hope showed uncharacteristic restlessness, pacing near the northern boundary of their enclosure. Shadow watched her with what Abigail had come to recognize as his version of parental concern, alert but not intervening, allowing her to process whatever was troubling her young mind. "She's sensing the coming changes," Mason observed, joining Abigail at the window. "Bears are incredibly perceptive to shifts in their environment, even subtle ones." "We'll implement the transition slowly," Abigail assured him. "Their well-being remains our priority, regardless of research opportunities." As darkness fell over Yellowstone, the observation cameras switched to infrared, revealing Shadow and Hope finally settled in their usual sleeping position, the growing juvenile still curled against her massive protector despite her increasing independence. The image captured the essence of their extraordinary relationship, a bond that had begun in crisis, developed through recovery, and now faced evolution as Hope matured. Abigail's drive home that evening took her past familiar Yellowstone landmarks now touched with the golden light of sunset. After 15 years of questioning, the investigation had finally confirmed what happened to Thomas. Victor's experimental hormone treatments had altered a bear's natural behavior, creating the aggressive response that took her husband's life. The knowledge brought closure, if not comfort. Tomorrow would bring the formal announcement of her transition to emeritus status with accompanying media coverage and public interest. The Shadow and Hope story had captured public imagination in ways that transcended typical wildlife narratives, perhaps because it spoke to something fundamentally human in its demonstration of protection, nurturing, and unexpected connection. At her cabin, Abigail found a package waiting on the porch, a framed photograph from Rebecca showing Shadow and Hope in a rare moment of play. The massive adult bear appeared almost gentle as he engaged with Hope's exuberant energy, his fearsome strength carefully contained to accommodate her smaller size. Inside the frame was a handwritten note. "You once told me that Thomas believed animals had emotional lives far more complex than science recognized. Shadow and Hope have proven him right. Thank you for allowing us to share their story and yours." The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect Yellowstone spring day. Abigail arrived at the center earlier than necessary, drawn by the desire to spend quiet time observing Shadow and Hope before the day's formal events began. From her favorite observation point, she watched the bears emerge from their night rest, Shadow leading Hope to the stream for morning fishing. Emily joined her, clipboard in hand with the day's schedule. "The press will arrive at 10. The official announcement is at 11, followed by the dedication of the Thomas Whitmore Research Wing." Abigail nodded, her attention still focused on the bears below. "Has the board approved the expanded territory implementation?" "Yes, construction begins next month. Hope will have her own primary space with controlled access points to Shadow's territory. We'll monitor their interactions as she transitions to greater independence." The plan represented the best scientific approach to their unprecedented situation, acknowledging Hope's need for developing autonomy while respecting the unique bond she shared with Shadow. No one could predict exactly how their relationship would evolve as Hope matured, but the center's design now incorporated flexibility to accommodate various possibilities. The morning's official events unfolded with expected formality. Media representatives captured Abigail's transition announcement, board members delivered prepared remarks about her contributions, and colleagues shared stories that balanced professional respect with personal warmth. Throughout it all, Abigail maintained the dignified composure that had characterized her career, though those who knew her well could see the emotion beneath her careful words. The dedication of the Thomas Whitmore Research Wing represented the most meaningful moment for Abigail personally. The new facility would house advanced studies in animal cognition and behavior, continuing the work Thomas had begun decades earlier. His theories about animal intelligence and emotional capacity, once considered overly anthropomorphic by many colleagues, had found validation through Shadow and Hope's extraordinary relationship. Thomas believed that our understanding of animal consciousness was limited primarily by our own preconceptions, Abigail said during the dedication. The work that will happen in this research wing continues his legacy by asking questions without assuming limitations, by observing what is, rather than what we expect to see. As the formal events concluded and guests began departing, Abigail found herself drawn once more to the observation area. Below, Shadow and Hope continued their daily activities, unaware of the human ceremonies marking transitions and commemorations. Their relationship existed in its own reality, complex, evolving, and still challenging scientific understanding. "What happens next?" Nathan asked, joining her at the window for a final interview. "For them and for you?" Abigail considered the question thoughtfully. "For Shadow and Hope, we'll follow their lead. Their relationship will continue evolving as Hope matures. We've created an environment that supports both connection and independence, but ultimately, they'll show us the way forward." "And for you?" he pressed gently. She smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with genuine warmth. "I'll continue consulting on their care and the research programs, but I'm also working on a book, combining Thomas's theories with what we've learned from Shadow and Hope. It's time to share these insights more broadly." Through the window they watched as Shadow demonstrated scent marking to Hope along the enclosure's western boundary. The growing juvenile bear followed his example with increasing confidence, her movements showing the refined coordination that came from months of careful instruction. When she completed the task successfully, Shadow nudged her gently with his massive head, a gesture of approval that needed no scientific interpretation. "You know," Nathan observed, "when Rebecca and I first stumbled across Shadow on that trail, we thought we were documenting a simple rescue story. We had no idea we were witnessing the beginning of something that would change scientific understanding." "The best discoveries often begin that way," Abigail replied, "not with grand theories, but with unexpected observations that challenge what we think we know." As evening approached and the center quieted, Abigail made a final circuit of the facility that had grown from emergency response to lasting legacy. Tomorrow, Emily would officially take the reins as director, leading the center into its next chapter with energy and vision. The research programs would continue exploring the depths of bear cognition and behavior, building on the foundation Shadow and Hope had helped establish. For her final moments alone with the bears, Abigail chose the most distant observation blind, a quiet space where she could watch without distraction. Shadow and Hope had returned to their favored resting place beneath the rock overhang. The massive adult bear curled protectively around his growing daughter. Though Hope now approached adolescence, their fundamental connection remained, transformed but undiminished by time and development. "Thank you," Abigail whispered to the bears who couldn't hear her words but had somehow heard her heart, "for showing us what was possible." As darkness settled over Yellowstone and stars appeared above the ancient landscape, Abigail Whitmore stepped away from daily scientific responsibilities into a new phase of her own journey. Like Hope, she faced transition and evolution. Like Shadow, she carried the marks of past wounds alongside remarkable resilience. The Shadow and Hope Center would continue its work without her daily presence, exploring the depths of animal consciousness and challenging human assumptions about wildlife behavior. The bears that had brought her to this unexpected chapter would continue their extraordinary relationship, writing a story science was still learning to understand. In the end, what had begun with a desperate bear seeking human help had become something far more profound, a window into possibilities that transcended traditional boundaries between species, between science and wonder, between what was known and what remained to be discovered. And in that space of discovery, Abigail had found not just professional fulfillment, but a kind of healing, a connection to Thomas's work and vision that felt like completion of a circle long left open. Shadow and Hope had changed scientific understanding, touched public consciousness, and transformed the final chapter of her career into perhaps its most meaningful contribution. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings for everyone involved in this remarkable journey. But tonight, under the vast Yellowstone sky, an elderly veterinarian and two extraordinary bears shared a moment of peaceful connection, each having saved the other in ways that defied simple explanation but resonated with profound truth. When life writes its final chapters, the most profound gifts often arrive unexpectedly. Abigail's story reminds us that our golden years can hold our greatest purpose, that wisdom earned through decades of living uniquely qualifies us to recognize miracles others might miss. Like shadow protecting hope against all natural instinct, we too can defy expectations in our later seasons. What sacred connections await us when we remain open to wonder? What healing might we find for old wounds when we pursue purpose beyond retirement? Abigail discovered that her lifetime of experience wasn't just a conclusion, but a foundation for her most meaningful work. Her story whispers to each of us, it's never too late to witness something extraordinary, to challenge assumptions, to complete circles left painfully open. The deepest fulfillment often arrives in life's twilight hours, when our hard-earned wisdom allows us to see connections others miss. What unexpected purpose has appeared in your life when you thought your most meaningful chapters were behind you? Or perhaps you're wondering, what wound from your past might find healing through an unexpected connection in your present? Please share your story in the comments. Your experience might be the very light someone else needs today.